He sold America's most expensive secret for the price of a used car, $35,000. That's what Ronald Pelton received for betraying an intelligence operation that cost $500 million to build. A surveillance mission so classified that even inside the NSA, only a handful of people knew it existed. January 1980, a bankrupt former technician walks into the Soviet embassy in Washington. No documents, no stolen files, just his memory. And inside that memory, he carried the blueprint to America's crown jewel, Operation Ivy Bells, underwater cable taps deep in Soviet waters, recording every military transmission, every strategic order, every secret the Kremlin thought was safe. He didn't need to smuggle anything out. He remembered it all, and for less than the cost of a Honda Civic, he emptied his mind to the KGB. But here's what the Soviets never told him. Here's the part that makes this story unbearable. The price he paid wasn't measured in dollars. Before we begin, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these hidden Cold War stories reach. And if you want more buried truths from the shadow wars that shaped our world, subscribe now. I bring you one forgotten story every day. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to the moment when one man's desperation became America's nightmare. Ronald William Pelton was born in 1941 in Benton Harbor, Michigan, a small industrial town on the shores of Lake Michigan, where nothing particularly remarkable ever happened. His childhood was ordinary in every sense. Middle-class parents, average grades, a quiet kid who kept to himself, the kind of American boy who could disappear into a crowd without leaving an impression. But Ronald Pelton had one extraordinary gift: memory. Not photographic in the Hollywood sense, but exceptional nonetheless. He could absorb technical information, retain complex details, and recall procedures with unusual precision. It was the kind of talent that goes unnoticed in high school, but becomes invaluable in the military. In 1960, at 17 years old, Pelton enlisted in the United States Air Force. He was assigned to communications intelligence, the invisible war of signals and codes that defined Cold War espionage. While American soldiers trained for conventional combat, Pelton learned to intercept Soviet military transmissions, to recognize patterns in encrypted communications, to understand the architecture of the enemy's secret conversations. He was good at it, remarkably good. By the time he transitioned to the National Security Agency in the late 1960s, Pelton had become exactly the kind of employee the NSA prized: technically skilled, security-conscious, and utterly unremarkable in appearance. He could walk through Fort Meade's secure corridors without drawing a second glance. He looked like an accountant. He worked like a master craftsman. For 14 years, Ronald Pelton sat inside the most secretive intelligence agency in the world. The NSA, so classified during the Cold War that Washington insiders joked the letters stood for No Such Agency. This was the organization that intercepted Soviet communications, cracked military codes, and listened to the Kremlin's most protected secrets. The NSA's annual budget exceeded that of the CIA. Its technical capabilities were decades ahead of anything the public knew existed. And Ronald Pelton had top-secret clearance with special intelligence access, the kind of clearance that gave him knowledge of operations so sensitive that their existence couldn't be acknowledged, even in classified documents outside the program itself. He knew about satellite intercepts over Soviet territory. He understood encryption vulnerabilities in Warsaw Pact communications. He had access to operational summaries of missions that cost hundreds of millions of dollars and required years of planning. Most importantly, he knew about Operation Ivy Bells. Ivy Bells was the crown jewel of American underwater intelligence, a joint NSA-Navy operation that seemed impossible even to those who executed it. Starting in the early 1970s, American submarines navigated deep into Soviet territorial waters in the Sea of Okhotsk, located underwater communication cables connecting Soviet Pacific naval bases, and physically attached recording devices to those cables. The pods captured everything: orders to submarine commanders, strategic military communications, classified conversations between Soviet admirals and Moscow. The technical challenges were staggering. The cables lay on the ocean floor in freezing pitch-black water. Soviet defenses patrolled the area constantly. American submarines had to approach undetected, deploy divers in hostile waters, attach sophisticated recording equipment without leaving evidence, and return months later to retrieve the data, all while avoiding detection by one of the most paranoid military powers on Earth. It worked. For years, it worked brilliantly. The intelligence gathered from Ivy Bells gave the United States unprecedented insight into Soviet naval strategy during the Cold War's most dangerous decade. The operation cost over $500 million. It involved some of the Navy's best submarine crews, the NSA's top technical minds, and represented one of the most audacious espionage successes in American history. Ronald Pelton knew every detail: the location of the taps, the submarines involved, the technical specifications of the recording equipment, the processing procedures back at NSA headquarters. He had absorbed it all with that exceptional memory, filed it away as part of his job, never imagining that one day this knowledge would become the only valuable thing he possessed. Because by 1979, Ronald Pelton's life was collapsing, not from enemy action or counterintelligence exposure, but from something far more ordinary and far more American: debt. He had borrowed recklessly, invested poorly, and spent beyond his means for years. His marriage was fracturing. Collection agencies called constantly. Credit card bills multiplied faster than his government salary could manage. By spring 1979, the man trusted with America's deepest secrets couldn't pay his own mortgage. On May 14, 1979, Ronald Pelton filed for bankruptcy. 2 months later, humiliated and desperate, he resigned from the National Security Agency. He walked out of Fort Meade believing his intelligence career was over. He had no idea it was just beginning. For 6 months after leaving the NSA, Ronald Pelton drifted through a fog of unemployment and desperation. He tried insurance sales. He worked security jobs. Nothing stuck. The skills that made him valuable inside the secret world of signals intelligence meant nothing in civilian life. No one needed a man who could memorize Soviet communications protocols. No one cared that he had once held some of the highest security clearances in American intelligence. What they cared about was money, and Pelton had none. The bankruptcy had wiped out his debts legally, but the psychological damage remained. He was $48,000 in the hole when he filed. His ex-wife received alimony he couldn't afford. His credit was destroyed. Job applications went nowhere. The man who had spent 14 years protecting America's most expensive secrets couldn't get hired to sell insurance policies in suburban Maryland. By Christmas 1979, Pelton had reached a conclusion that would alter the Cold War's hidden battlefield. He still possessed something valuable. He still carried secrets worth millions. The only question was whether he had the courage or the desperation to sell them. On January 14, 1980, Ronald Pelton walked up the steps of the Soviet Embassy on 16th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. No appointment, no intermediary, no elaborate spycraft. He simply walked through the front door of the most heavily surveilled building in the American capital and asked to speak with someone from the KGB. The receptionist, trained to handle walk-ins with extreme caution, studied this unremarkable middle-aged man in his worn winter coat. Walk-ins were always dangerous. They could be FBI provocations, mentally unstable conspiracy theorists, or genuine defectors. The art was determining which category applied before the Americans outside realized what was happening. Pelton was escorted to a secure room. A KGB officer arrived, cautious, professional, radiating the quiet authority of Soviet intelligence. He asked Pelton to explain why he was there. "I worked at the National Security Agency for 14 years, Pelton said. "I resigned 7 months ago, but I still remember everything I knew, and I'm willing to share that information in exchange for money." The KGB officer had heard dozens of walk-in pitches over the years. Most were worthless. disgruntled government employees with access to mundane paperwork, amateurs who watched too many spy movies, or outright fabricators hoping to con money from Soviet intelligence. But something about Pelton's demeanor suggested authenticity, the specificity of his claim, the calmness in his voice, the absence of theatrical drama. "What kind of information?" the officer asked. Pelton mentioned a few operational code names, carefully chosen details that only someone with genuine NSA access would know. The officer's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted slightly. He excused himself to make a phone call to the Residentura, the KGB station chief, who would need to contact Moscow Center for authorization. Within 2 hours, Pelton was sitting across from a senior KGB intelligence officer who specialized in technical operations against American targets. The real debriefing began. "Tell me about NSA collection programs in the Pacific Theater," the officer said. Pelton took a breath. This was the moment. Once he spoke, there would be no walking it back, no claim of confusion or misunderstanding. He would become, in the eyes of American law, a traitor. "There's an operation called Ivy Bells," he began. The room went absolutely silent. Ivy Bells was not a name that appeared in any public record. It wasn't whispered in intelligence circles. It was a compartmented program known only to a small number of NSA officials, Navy commanders, and White House advisors. The Soviets had no idea it existed, and Ronald Pelton, sitting in a secure room in their Washington embassy, was about to describe it in complete detail. He explained the underwater cable taps in the Sea of Okhotsk, the submarines that deployed them, the recording pods attached to Soviet military communication lines, the intelligence gathered from those intercepts, years of Soviet naval communications, captured and analyzed by American cryptologists. He described technical specifications, operational procedures, and processing methods with the precision of a man who had lived inside the program's classified world. The KGB officers took notes. They asked clarifying questions. They requested details about equipment, locations, and timing. Pelton answered everything from memory. Not a single document changed hands. He didn't need documents. It was all in his head. By the time Pelton left the embassy that evening, he had given the Soviet Union one of the most valuable intelligence breakthroughs of the Cold War. In exchange, the KGB gave him $5,000 in cash and a promise of more to come. Ronald Pelton walked back into the winter night a different man than he'd been that morning. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and he had done it for money. The KGB handled Ronald Pelton with extreme care. He was not a typical agent, not ideologically motivated, not politically driven, not emotionally connected to the Soviet cause. He was purely transactional, a man who had sold secrets for cash and would need to be managed accordingly. Over the next several months, Pelton met with his Soviet handlers multiple times. Some meetings occurred in Washington, arranged through carefully orchestrated contact procedures. Others took place overseas. Vienna was a favorite location, neutral ground where East and West conducted their shadow business away from the intense surveillance of Cold War capitals. The debriefings were exhaustive. KGB technical specialists asked Pelton to reconstruct everything he knew about NSA operations. They wanted details about signals intelligence collection methods, encryption vulnerabilities, satellite intercept programs, and cooperative arrangements with Allied intelligence services. Pelton provided it all, drawing on his exceptional memory to recreate classified briefings, operational summaries, and technical specifications he had absorbed during 14 years inside America's most secretive agency. The KGB paid him in increments. Another $5,000 here, $10,000 after a particularly valuable session. By the end of their operational relationship, Pelton had received approximately $35,000. In $1980, that was enough to buy a decent car, maybe cover a year's rent in a modest apartment. It was nowhere near enough to justify what he had given away. The asymmetry was staggering. Operation Ivy Bells alone had cost the United States more than $500 million to develop and execute. The intelligence it generated was considered priceless, strategic insights into Soviet naval operations that couldn't be obtained through any other means. Pelton had sold it for roughly 1/14,000th of its development cost. But to Pelton, desperate and drowning in financial chaos, $35,000 felt like salvation. He paid off debts. He bought himself breathing room. For a few months, the crushing anxiety of bankruptcy and unemployment lifted slightly. He convinced himself he had done what was necessary to survive. The rationalization required extraordinary mental compartmentalization. Pelton had to live as an ordinary American citizen while knowing he had committed one of the most damaging acts of espionage in modern American history. He couldn't tell anyone, couldn't explain the sudden influx of cash, couldn't acknowledge the weight of what he had done. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Soviet military intelligence analyzed Pelton's revelations with growing satisfaction. The information about Ivy Bells was catastrophic for American intelligence. The KGB now understood exactly how the United States had been penetrating Soviet military communications. They knew the locations of the cable taps, the methods used to install them, and the intelligence being gathered. But the Soviets faced a delicate problem. If they reacted too quickly or too obviously, the Americans would know they had been compromised. They would launch a mole hunt. They would review everyone who had access to Ivy Bells. Eventually, they might identify Pelton, so Moscow moved carefully. In 1981, Soviet engineers conducted what appeared to be a routine maintenance dive on underwater cables in the Sea of Okhotsk. During that dive, they discovered the American recording devices. The reaction was carefully calibrated. Outrage at American espionage, but not so much outrage that it suggested prior knowledge. The taps were removed. The cables were rerouted. Soviet naval communications were re-encrypted using new protocols. Within months, one of America's most valuable intelligence operations had gone completely silent. At NSA headquarters in Fort Meade, analysts noticed the sudden loss of Okhotsk intercepts. Technical teams reviewed the operation's security protocols. Had the equipment malfunctioned? Had Soviet counterintelligence detected American submarines during a deployment? Or had something worse happened? Had they been betrayed? Internal security reviews were launched, but they focused primarily on current NSA employees with access to the program. Pelton, who had resigned nearly 2 years earlier, never appeared on their radar. The assumption was logical. Why would someone with access to such valuable secrets wait 18 months after leaving the agency to betray them? Espionage usually happened while the person still had access to classified material. That assumption protected Ronald Pelton for 5 years. From 1980 to 1985, he lived in a strange limbo, free but haunted, unpunished but never at peace. The KGB limited contact to protect their asset. The money he had received was spent, dissolved back into the same financial chaos that had driven him to treason in the first place. He moved through ordinary American life, new jobs that didn't last, relationships that fractured, the everyday struggles of middle-aged mediocrity. But beneath the surface, Pelton carried a secret that grew heavier with each passing year. He had betrayed his country. He had sold its most protected secrets, and he knew, somewhere in the back of his mind, that betrayal of this magnitude never stays buried forever. The beginning of the end came from an unexpected direction, not from American counterintelligence, not from surveillance technology, but from the conscience of a Soviet spy who decided he could no longer live with his own betrayals. Vitaly Yurchenko was a senior KGB officer who had spent decades inside Soviet intelligence. He knew the inner workings of KGB operations against the United States. He knew about recruitment methods, active agents, and compromised American officials. By the summer of 1985, Yurchenko had reached his breaking point. Personal problems, ideological doubts, and the weight of his own complicity in the Cold War's shadow games had become unbearable. On August 1, 1985, while on assignment in Rome, Vitaly Yurchenko walked into the American embassy and defected to the United States. The CIA handled his debriefing with intense secrecy. Yurchenko was flown to a safe house outside Washington, where intelligence officers spent weeks extracting everything he knew about Soviet operations. The information was gold. Yurchenko revealed active KGB agents inside Western governments. He described recruitment techniques, communication methods, and operational priorities. And then, almost casually during one debriefing session, he mentioned something that made the CIA officers lean forward in their chairs. "There was an American who walked into our embassy in Washington," Yurchenko said. "Early 1980, I think. He worked for NSA. He gave us information about underwater surveillance operations, cable taps in Soviet waters. Very valuable intelligence. The KGB paid him, but not much, maybe $30,000 or $40,000 over time." The CIA officers asked for more details. Yurchenko didn't know the man's name. The KGB had compartmented that information to protect their source. But he knew enough. The timeline. Resigned from NSA around 1979. The motivation? Financial desperation. The operation compromised, something involving underwater cables and Soviet naval communications. The information was immediately passed to the FBI, which had jurisdiction over domestic counterintelligence. Special agents began a methodical review. They pulled personnel records for every NSA employee who had resigned between 1978 and 1980. They cross-referenced those names against employees who had access to sensitive technical operations. They looked for signs of financial distress, bankruptcies, divorces, sudden debt. The circle narrowed quickly. Only a handful of NSA employees fit the profile, and one name stood out with disturbing clarity: Ronald William Pelton. Pelton had resigned in July 1979. He had filed for bankruptcy that same year. He had held top-secret clearances with access to highly compartmented programs, and according to his work history, he had detailed knowledge of signals intelligence operations in the Pacific Theater. The FBI opened a full investigation. They reviewed Pelton's financial records and found unexplained income in 1980 and 1981, small amounts, but enough to raise questions. They examined his travel records and discovered trips to Vienna during periods when the KGB was known to meet with American sources in that city. They placed him under surveillance and watched as he moved through his ordinary, unremarkable life in suburban Maryland. But they needed more. They needed a confession or incontrovertible evidence. Without Yurchenko's testimony in court, which would be complicated by diplomatic and security concerns, the case against Pelton was circumstantial. So the FBI decided on a bold approach. They would confront Pelton directly. On November 24, 1985, the Sunday after Thanksgiving, FBI agents knocked on Ronald Pelton's door. It was a calculated moment. The holiday weekend. The quiet suburban street, the psychological pressure of federal agents arriving at his home. Pelton answered the door and found himself face to face with special agents who identified themselves and asked if they could come inside to talk. He let them in. He could have refused. He could have demanded a lawyer. But something in Pelton, exhaustion perhaps, or relief that the waiting was finally over, made him agree to speak with them. The agents laid out what they knew. A Soviet defector had described an NSA walk-in who compromised underwater surveillance operations. The timeline matched. The profile matched. The financial indicators matched. "Mr. Pelton," one agent said, "we believe that person was you." Pelton sat in silence for a long moment. 5 years of secrets. 5 years of carrying the weight of betrayal. 5 years of waiting for this knock on the door. And then, almost quietly, he began to talk. He described walking into the Soviet embassy in January 1980. He explained the meetings with KGB officers. He detailed what he had told them about NSA operations, about Ivy Bells, about America's most protected intelligence programs. He talked about the money, how little it had been, how quickly it had disappeared, how it had never been enough to justify what he had given away. The confession lasted hours. By the time it ended, Ronald Pelton had admitted to one of the most damaging espionage cases in American history. The only question remaining was what price he would pay. Ronald Pelton was formally arrested and charged under the Espionage Act, Title 18, United States Code, Section 794, one of the most serious charges in federal law. The penalty was life imprisonment or death. The government made clear from the beginning they would seek the maximum sentence. The trial began in May 1986 in the United States District Court in Baltimore. It presented extraordinary challenges. How do you prosecute a man for revealing secrets so classified that even describing them in open court could damage national security? How do you convince a jury of the gravity of his crimes without exposing the very operations he betrayed? The solution was a hybrid approach. Much of the trial occurred behind closed doors in classified sessions, where NSA officials testified about the technical details of what Pelton had compromised. But enough information was presented in open court to establish the scope and impact of his betrayal. Vitaly Yurchenko testified, describing the moment KGB officers realized they had acquired a source with access to one of America's crown jewel operations. NSA officials, speaking carefully to avoid further compromising classified programs, explained that Pelton's betrayal had cost the United States years of intelligence gathering and hundreds of millions of dollars in operational losses. Former colleagues from Fort Meade took the stand, describing Pelton as competent, trustworthy, and utterly unremarkable. Exactly the kind of employee who could access the most sensitive programs without raising suspicion. The portrait that emerged was unsettling. A spy who looked like an accountant, who had no ideological motivation, who had simply decided that money mattered more than loyalty. The defense tried to argue that Pelton's financial desperation constituted a form of diminished capacity, that bankruptcy and depression had impaired his judgment. But the prosecution countered with devastating effectiveness. Pelton had not acted impulsively. He had planned his approach to the Soviet embassy. He had negotiated payment. He had maintained contact with the KGB for years. This was not a moment of weakness. It was calculated betrayal sustained over time. The most damaging testimony came from Pelton himself. During FBI interrogation, he had been recorded explaining his motivation with brutal simplicity. I needed the money. No regret. No acknowledgement of the moral weight of what he had done, just a transactional explanation for selling his country's secrets. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. On June 5, 1986, they returned their verdict, guilty on all counts of espionage and conspiracy. At sentencing, Pelton was given an opportunity to address the court. He stood, a middle-aged man in an ill-fitting suit, looking more like a failed insurance salesman than a Cold War spy, and offered a brief statement. He expressed regret, though whether he regretted the betrayal itself or simply the consequences remained unclear. He mentioned his family, his financial struggles, his years of service to the NSA. But he offered no real explanation for why those struggles justified what he had done. The judge showed no mercy. He sentenced Ronald Pelton to 3 concurrent life sentences plus 10 years. Pelton was 44 years old. Unless granted clemency or parole, he would die in federal prison. As he was led from the courtroom, Pelton looked back once at the empty gallery. No family had come. No friends had testified on his behalf. He had sold America's secrets and gained nothing. Not wealth, not security, not even the cold comfort of ideological conviction. Just $35,000 that had evaporated as quickly as it arrived. The damage assessment continued long after the trial ended. Operation Ivy Bells was permanently compromised. The Soviets had removed every cable tap, rerouted critical communications, and upgraded their encryption systems. The intelligence advantage the United States had spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars to build had vanished overnight. Other NSA programs Pelton had described were similarly compromised. Soviet military communications were restructured. Counter-surveillance methods were improved. The entire architecture of American signals intelligence in the Pacific Theater had to be rebuilt from scratch. But perhaps the deepest damage was psychological. The NSA prided itself on security, on being the intelligence agency that couldn't be penetrated. And yet Ronald Pelton, an unremarkable technician drowning in debt, had walked out with some of America's most protected secrets stored in his memory and sold them for the price of a used car. The security failures exposed by his case led to sweeping reforms: enhanced financial monitoring of employees with security clearances, improved psychological screening, more rigorous counterintelligence protocols. The NSA had learned a brutal lesson. The greatest vulnerability in any intelligence operation is not technology or tactics. It is the human being who has access to them. Ronald Pelton remains in federal prison today, now in his 80s, serving the remainder of his life sentence. The secrets he sold belonged to a Cold War that ended decades ago. The Soviet Union he served no longer exists, but the principle he violated endures. Some betrayals can never be justified, some prices can never be paid, and some secrets, once sold, can never be reclaimed.